Welcome back to another project. In this project, you're going to create a rotating image gallery. As you can see from the final version, we'll have a rotating gallery that changes every 3 seconds, for example. We'll also have these 2 buttons here. When we click the next button, it will move to the next image. And when we click the previous button, it will go back to the previous image. We're going to use JavaScript to dynamically change the images using timers, and we'll also add event listeners for these buttons. Additionally, we'll use the CSS transform method to rotate the images just like this. In the next section, we'll get started with the HTML part of our project. So I'll see you in the next section. All right, let's get started with our project. First, let's open Visual Studio Code. Once it's open, we'll go ahead and close the Get Started tab. Next, go to the File menu and click on Open Folder. I'd like to create this project on my desktop, but you can choose any location on your computer that works for you. For this tutorial, let's click on the desktop. Now, click the New Folder button to create a new directory. Let's name this folder, for example, Rotating Image Gallery. Then just press Enter to confirm the name. With that, click the Select Folder button to open it. Now let's close the Get Started tab again. On the left side in the Explorer section, right-click and select New File. Name the file index.html and press Enter. You'll see your empty index.html file on the right. We can quickly generate an HTML5 boilerplate by using an exclamation mark. Just type an exclamation mark and click on the first auto suggestion that appears. Now that we have our HTML5 boilerplate, notice the first line is the doc type, which tells the browser which version of HTML the page is using. Since we are using HTML5, it simply specifies HTML here. Next, we have the HTML tag, which serves as the top-level element of the entire document. Inside this tag, you'll find both the head and body tags. The lang attribute inside the opening HTML tag is used to set the language of the page. In our case, we've set the language to English. Moving on, the head tag contains 3 metadata tags as well as a title tag. The charset attribute in the first meta tag defines the character encoding. HTML5 recommends UTF-8 for all developers because it supports almost all characters and symbols. The next meta attribute instructs Internet Explorer to use the most recent rendering engine, which is Edge. The viewport meta tag tells the browser how to handle the page's dimensions and resizing. Let's use Alt-Z to turn on word wrap so we can see all of our code clearly. Within the viewport settings, the content attribute first sets the page width to match the device's screen width. It then initializes the browser's zoom level to 100%. The title tag is what actually sets the title displayed in the browser tab. To view your work directly inside Visual Studio Code, you can use the Live Preview extension. Just right-click on your index.html file and select Live Preview, Show Preview. Now, we can see the browser on the right side. It's completely empty, but it does have the title document. Let's close this Explorer section by dragging this line to the left so we have more space on the right side. Next, let's change the browser title to our project's name. The project's name is Rotating Image Gallery. Now that the title is set, let's start coding inside the body section. First, we'll create a container for our images. To do this, we'll create a div with a class of ImageContainer. We'll press Enter to accept the auto suggestion. Now, inside this container, we're going to add 8 images. We'll wrap each image in a span tag because we want to rotate them later using the transform property in CSS. For the first span, the style will be I1. Here we are actually defining a variable called I for each span, and we're setting the first one to 1. This way, we can rotate each image by 45 degrees later using CSS, and each image will be unique because they each have a different variable value. And inside this span, we'll add an img tag, and the src will be an external image URL. For this project, I'd like to use a website called Lorem Ipsum to source our images. So let's go back to the desktop and open Google Chrome. In the search bar, we'll search for Lorem Ipsum. In the search results, we see a website called lorempixum.photos. Let's click on that. This website actually pulls all of its images from unsplash.com. The best part is, to get these images, we don't need any code, an API key, or even to sign up. As you can see here, we can fetch a specific image by adding the ID followed by .image. We are using this specific link. The ID for this dark picture is 23.7. Then the 200 and 300 represent the height and width of the image. We'll copy this URL, go back to Visual Studio Code, and paste it into the src attribute of our image. Now we can see the dog in our browser, but I want to swap the 300 and 200 to get the correct aspect ratio for our image. We don't strictly need the alt attribute for this project. We can just copy this span and the image inside it 7 more times using Alt Shift plus down arrow 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then we'll change the style ID of the second one to 2. We can also change the ID of the image to pull a different random image. However, this specific image will remain the same every time we refresh the page. It's essentially a static image. So let's change the number, for example, to 23 to get a new one. As you can see, here is the next one. For the third one, we'll set the style to 3 and pick another random number, like 48. Moving on, we can see this one would be 4. And for this one, let's use 97 as an example. However, there isn't an image available for this specific number. So let's just change it to 23, for example. Since we've already used 23, let's go with 12 instead. And then the next one is 5. For the number, we'll use 59 as an example. Next, we have 6.
We have 6.
Sorry, 6 is right here. And then we have the number, let's say 160. And there we go. We've got this font image. Next, we have 7. For this one, let's use 370. And for the last one, we have 8. And for the picture, let's just use 478. All right.
78. All right.
This is just a random image we pulled from this website. You can use any website and any image you like for your own project. Now let's continue with our own project. After this div with the class image_container, we'll add another div with the class button_container because we want to have 2 buttons at the bottom. These buttons will allow us to navigate to the next and previous images. So we'll just create a div with the class btn_container. And inside this div, we'll add 2 buttons. The first one will have the class btn and an ID of prev for the previous button. Inside this button, we'll just write prev. Then we press enter to accept the auto suggestion. And there we have the button with the class btn and the ID prev. Now we'll copy this button and change the text to next and do the same for the second one. And that's it for the HTML part of our project. In the next section, we're going to start styling our project using CSS. So I'll see you in the next section. All right, in the last section, we finished the HTML part of our project. Now in this section, we're going to start styling our project using CSS. First, we need to create a CSS file. Starting from index.html, we'll click here and open the Explorer section using Ctrl-Shift-E. Then on the left side in the Explorer section, we'll right-click and select New File. We'll name the file style.css and press enter. Before we can use CSS in our project, we must add a link to the CSS file within our HTML code. So let's switch back to the index.html file and add a link tag right after the title tag. Just type link and click on the third auto suggestion, the one that includes the CSS. Now we have a link tag that establishes the relationship between the HTML file and our external style sheet. The href attribute here defines the destination of the link. Since both files are located in the same directory, we just need to write style.css for the URL. Now we can start styling our project using CSS. First, let's save the file using Ctrl+S. We'll close the Explorer section to create more space on the left, then head over to style.css to start styling from the body section. We'll just write body. Then we'll open a set of curly braces. First, let's remove the default margin by writing margin 0. Next, let's bring the items to the horizontal center by changing the display to flex and using justify content. As you can see, once we change the display to flex, the buttons appear next to the pictures. However, we want the buttons to appear below the pictures. To fix this, we'll change the flex direction to column to move the buttons to the bottom. Now we can use align items, center to center the buttons, and text align, center to center the pictures. We also want to bring everything to the center vertically. To do this, we need to set the height to 100% of the viewport height. Then we'll change justify content to center to bring everything to the vertical center. Let's also change the background color to black. Finally, let's remove the scroll bars using overflow hidden. All right, as you can see, the buttons aren't visible right now. However, once we set up the image container and its images, we'll bring them together so the buttons become visible later on. To get started, let's move to the styling section and set up an image container div to hold all the images in our project. We'll target that div by using a dot followed by image container, and then we'll open a set of curly braces. First, let's set both the width and the height to 200 pixels. Next, let's set the transform style to preserve 3D so we can apply 3D effects to our images. Now let's adjust the transform property. We'll use the transform property with the perspective function, setting the perspective to 100 pixels. Actually, sorry, let's make that 1000 pixels. I'll explain why I chose 1000 later. You won't see much of an effect right now, but we'll adjust it soon to see the results in the browser. First, we need to set up the images and the rest of the elements to actually see the effects of this perspective. Next, let's change the rotateY and set the angle to 0 degrees. We'll see the effects as soon as we style this span and the image. Let's start by styling this span. We'll target the image container and then select this span. First, we'll set its position to absolute. To make absolute positioning work correctly relative to its parent, we need to set the image container's position to relative. This way, the span will be positioned absolutely relative to the image container. Then we'll set both the top and left properties to 0. We'll also set the transform here by adding rotateY. If you remember, we previously added a variable to the span style to give each one a different number. For example, the variable I might be 1, 2, 3, etc.
to 8.
We're going to change the rotateY based on this variable value. We'll calculate the degrees by taking our variable I and multiplying it by 45 degrees. As you can see, the images are now changing. Each picture is rotating by 45 degrees, making each one different from the next. For example, the first one is at 45 degrees, the second one is at 90 degrees, and so on. Also, if you want them to form a circle or a sphere shape, we need to add a translate Z, setting it to something like 400 pixels. Now, if we open this in a browser, you can see the effect much more clearly. As you can see, all the images are now arranged around each other. Now let's look at the image itself, specifically the image tag. To target that image tag, we'll use the selector image container.spanImg. First, we'll set its position to absolute and bring it exactly to the center by setting both the left and top properties to 0. We'll also set the width to 200%. Looking here, it seems we forgot to set the width of this span to 100%. So let's set this one to 100% as well. Now you can see that all the images are arranged around each other in a much nicer way. In the next section, we're going to use JavaScript to make them rotate automatically. But for now, let's start by styling these buttons. First, we'll target the button container. We'll simply use the btn container class. We'll set its position to relative so that we can later position each button to the left and right using absolute positioning. Next, we'll set the width to 80% and use justify content space between. This way, we can have one button on the left and the other on the right side. Now, let's move on to styling each individual button. We'll set their position to absolute. As you can see, they are currently stacked on top of each other, but that's fine for now. We'll position them individually a bit later on. Actually, we don't really need justify content since we are using absolute positioning to place the buttons. To adjust it, let's bring this one down slightly by setting the button's top position to 80 pixels. Next, we can use background color to change the color of the button. Let's set it to slate blue. Then we'll change the text color to white. We'll also remove the border by setting it to none. Now let's add some padding. We'll set the padding to 10 pixels for the top and bottom and 20 pixels for the left and right. Let's add a border radius of, say, 5 pixels. And finally, we'll change the cursor to a pointer. This way, when you hover over the buttons, you'll see the pointing hand cursor. All right, let's change the color of the button for when we hover over it. To do this, we'll just use the .btn:/hover selector and add a filter. We'll use the brightness filter, and we want to make it 50% brighter.
All right.
Now that we've handled the hover effect, let's position each button. For the first one, the left button will set its left position to 20%. You can see the change right here. As for the next button, we'll set its right position to 20% as well. Now, if you resize the screen, you'll see that the buttons stay positioned on the left and right.
All right.
In the next section, we're going to use JavaScript to make this gallery change automatically. For example, we can make it switch every 3 seconds. We'll also use the addEventListener method to add event handlers to each button. This way, when we click them, we can navigate to the next or previous image. I'll see you in the next section for the JavaScript part of our project. All right, we've finished styling our project using CSS in the previous section. In this section, we're going to start adding functionality to our project using JavaScript. First, we need to create a new JavaScript file. To start, let's open the Explorer section by pressing Ctrl-Shift-E. Once the Explorer is open on the left, right-click and select New File. Name the file index.js and press Enter. Before we can use JavaScript, we need to link this file within our HTML code. So let's switch back to index.html and add a script tag at the very end of the body section. Just type sc and click on the second auto suggestion, the one that includes the src attribute. Since both index.html and index.js are in the same directory, we just need to set the URL to index.js. Now we're all set to use JavaScript in our project. First, let's save this file using Ctrl-S. Now let's close the Explorer section. There are 3 main elements we need to bring into our JavaScript. We need these 2 buttons and this image container. We need the image container because we want to manipulate the styles within it. To make this effect work, we will specifically target the transform properties like setting the perspective to 1000 pixels and the rotate y-axis to 0 degrees. Adjusting these specific values is exactly how we will change the appearance and 3-dimensional depth of our image on the screen. For example, it is currently set to 0. If we change it to 45, we move to the next image. Similarly, if we change it to 90, we move to the second one. So By changing this rotateY function and increasing its value step by 45 degrees, we can cycle through the images in the gallery. First, we'll set it to 0, and then we need to bring this element into our JavaScript. To do this, we can use the querySelector method to return this element. We can also use the getElementById method to select these two buttons, since they have the IDs prev and next. Now, inside our JavaScript, let's create a constant and set it to the image container element. We'll name this constant image container and set it equal to document.querySelector. For the CSS selector, we'll use image container. We can use Alt-Z to turn on word wrap so we can see the code more clearly. Next, let's grab the left button, also known as the prev button. We'll simply call it prev element. We'll set it equal to document.getElementById with the ID prev. We can copy this line using Alt+Shift+arrow down. Now we'll change prev to next, and we'll change this one to next as well. Now we're going to add an addEventListener method to each button so we can track when they are clicked. When we click next, we want to see the next image in the sequence. And when we click the Previous's button, we want to go back to the previous image. First, let's add the addEventListener to the prev button. We'll just type addEventListener. The first parameter inside addEventListener is the event handler. The event handler we want to use here is click. The second parameter is a callback function, which will be triggered whenever the event occurs. In other words, it runs when someone clicks on the button. Once that happens, the first thing we want to do is update our value. Let's create a variable to manage our increments of 0 and 45. We'll call it x. Let's start by setting let x 0. Then when someone clicks the button, we want to update it using x equals x plus 45. This way we add 45 degrees to our x value each time. After that, we want to update the gallery. To do this, we'll create a function called updateGallery. To create the function, we just write function updateGallery, then open a set of parentheses and a set of curly braces. The purpose of this updateGallery function is to change the style of the transform property. First, we target that property by writing imageContainerElement.style.transform. Then we set it equal to a string where we want to include a variable. We'll use backticks to allow for template literals, and then we'll write perspective. This value remains constant. We'll set it to 1000 pixels and then change the rotateY. Instead of just using 0 degrees, we'll add a variable here. Specifically, we add a variable using the $sign followed by a set of curly braces. And after that, we add the word deg for degrees. This variable represents our rotation value. Now, when we click on the previews, this value will change. First, let's check the rotateY and perspective values. Wait, the perspective is written incorrectly here. We also need to fix the function name, which is currently written incorrectly. So let's delete this extra A here. Now, when we click on previous, you can see the previous image. Let's add a transition so the movement looks smoother. To do that, we'll go back to our CSS file. Here we'll add a transition property to the transform, and we'll set the duration to 0.7 seconds. Now you can see a smooth transition when moving between images. Let's do the same thing for the next button as well. We can copy this, then change prev to next, and change the plus sign to a minus sign. Now when we click next, we see the next image, and clicking previous shows the previous one. Let's add a timer so we can turn this into a slideshow. Inside the gallery function, we'll add a setTimeout method. The setTimeout method sets a timer that executes a function once the timer expires. So we'll just write setTimeout. This setTimeout function takes two arguments. The first is the function that will be executed once the timer finishes. The second parameter is the timer itself. Keep in mind that this time is measured in milliseconds. So if we write 3000, it means the delay will be 3 seconds.
Get.
We want this setTimeout to call our function after 3 seconds so we can move to the next slide. Modify the x value by subtracting 45. Then execute the update gallery function. But before we let the loop run automatically, we need to call this function once to start the loop. So we'll just call the function right here. Now, after 3 seconds, you can see that the gallery starts moving automatically. However, there's a problem. When we click the next or previous buttons, we call this function multiple times, setting too many setTimeout calls at once, which causes issues in our project. To fix this, we need to reset the setTimeout before calling the function again. We can do this by creating a variable here. We can call it timer to keep things simple. We'll set timer equal to this setTimeout call. Then we'll use clearTimeout to clear the existing timer. We'll copy and paste that logic here as well, making sure it runs before the function is called. Now, when we click next or previous, we first reset the setTimeout so it doesn't interfere with the normal operation. Let's check how it works in the browser. As you can see here, after refreshing the page, everything works perfectly. And that's it for this project. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot of new things. I'll see you in the next project.